At 11 years old, I learned a brutal truth no one warns you about. Sometimes the moment adults call you strong is the moment they decide you no longer deserve protection. And the day my life cracked open started with a suitcase rolling across our hallway and a smile that felt rehearsed. My name is Maya, and that summer my mother left me standing barefoot on cold tiles with a wrinkled $20 bill pressed into my palm like it was a solution instead of a sentence. She told me she was going to Europe, just for a while, said I was old enough to handle myself, said independence would be good for me, then kissed my forehead and walked out before I could ask who would check on me or what I should do when the food ran out. The front door closed, the lock clicked, and the house fell into a silence so deep it felt like pressure on my ears. I tried to sound brave when I whispered, "I'll be okay," but my voice shook anyway, and no one corrected me. At first, I treated it like a test I could pass if I tried hard enough, lining up what little food we had like pieces on a game board, telling myself smart people made things last, that survivors learned quickly. I cut bread into thin slices, spread peanut butter so carefully it barely covered the surface, and laughed at myself for taking it so seriously, because laughing felt safer than admitting I was scared. On the counter sat the emergency credit card she'd tossed there at the last second, shiny and promising. But when I tried to order food, every app rejected it, again and again, until I understood it wasn't activated and I didn't know the PIN. So it was just me, a useless card, and $20 that already felt smaller. By the third day, the house started to feel alive in the worst way. Pipes ticking, floors creaking, the refrigerator humming like it was mocking me. So I kept the TV on just for noise, not caring what played, because silence made the fear louder. The pantry emptied faster than I wanted to admit. The fridge looked like a joke, and my stomach growled so loudly it embarrassed me even though I was alone. That was when I opened my notebook and wrote a word at the top of the page without really knowing why. Evidence. Under it, I listed facts, not feelings, because facts couldn't be argued with later. Left alone at 11, one $20 bill, no food plan, no adult checking in. Writing it down changed something inside me, like I was no longer just waiting for rescue, but preparing for a future version of myself who would need proof. I started recording short videos on my phone, whispering the day and what I'd eaten, showing the empty shelves and the dead card on the counter, telling the camera I was still alone, because part of me hoped no one would ever see them, and another part wanted them to explode into the open when my mother came back. By day 5, hunger wrapped my head in fog. Standing up made the room spin, and I ate dry cereal out of the box in the back of the cupboard like it was contraband. Then wrote another line in my notebook saying there had still been no calls, no texts, no check-ins. I hovered over my best friend's name on my phone, wanting to ask for help, but instead I sent a normal message so I wouldn't have to explain the truth. And when there was no reply, I told myself everyone else was busy living normal lives with parents who didn't disappear. On day 7, anger finally outweighed fear, and when I looked out the window at kids riding bikes and adults walking dogs with coffee cups, something hardened in me as I whispered that she had chosen a vacation over me, and one day that choice would cost her. That was when the doorbell rang, sharp and unfamiliar, and my heart slammed so hard I thought I might throw up. I almost didn't answer, almost stayed invisible like I had all week, but a louder thought cut through the panic and told me this might be the moment someone finally saw me. So I opened the door to a man in a green jacket with my school's logo stitched on the chest. The counselor I recognized only after a second because I'd never seen him without a classroom behind him. He said my name gently, told me he'd been trying to reach my parents, asked if he could come in, and something in my body gave up the lie before my mouth could form it. So I stepped aside and let him see the sink full of dishes, the empty counter, the nearly bare fridge. When he asked where my parents were, I told him Europe, and when he asked who was staying with me, I said no one, because they said I was old enough, and the look on his face shifted from polite concern to something heavy and serious as he sat down and asked how long I'd been alone, what I'd been eating, whether anyone had checked on me. I laughed then, a small, bitter sound I didn't recognize, and told him about the dead card and the $20, and when he said quietly that this wasn't just irresponsible but dangerous, that it was neglect and there were laws about this, The words hit me like something from a TV show that had somehow landed in my kitchen. I asked what would happen if people found out, and when he said agencies would get involved and my parents would have to answer for their choices, I felt a strange calm settle under the fear, because consequences finally had a shape. When he asked if I wanted help, real help that made sure this never happened again, I hesitated only long enough to feel the weight of my notebook in my hands before saying yes, because I was tired of protecting adults who hadn't protected me. He called my neighbor, a woman who rushed over with worry written all over her face, asking why I hadn't come to her sooner, and when I blurted out that I didn't want to look weak, she told me asking for help wasn't weakness but survival, and sometimes it was the only way to make adults face what they'd done. When the caseworker arrived, she walked through the house slowly, her eyes lingering on the empty shelves and useless credit card, and asked gentle questions I answered honestly, including the last message my mother had sent, a smiling selfie from Paris with a caption about being free. Free from what, the caseworker asked, and I didn't have to think before answering. From me. They arranged for me to stay with my neighbor while they contacted my parents, and as I packed a small bag and tucked my notebook inside, I realized I wasn't just leaving a house, I was leaving the role of the invisible kid. That night, sitting at a table with real food and warm light, I wrote a statement for the report in careful handwriting, telling my mother that maturity didn't cancel hunger or fear, that counting crumbs wasn't independence, and that if there were consequences waiting when she came home, they weren't betrayal, they were truth catching up. When I finally ate a full meal, I almost cried, not because of the food, but because safety had a taste I'd forgotten. And as the adults talked quietly about investigations and next steps, I understood something that would stay with me forever. The decision she thought would make her life easier had given me a voice, and once the truth is written down, recorded and shared, it becomes something no suitcase, no vacation, and no smile can ever pack away again. In the days that followed, time moved differently, slower but heavier, like every hour carried weight now that adults were watching and writing things down. Mrs. Carter's house became my temporary world, a place where doors didn't slam shut without explanation, and where someone asked if I was hungry before my stomach had to beg for attention. Each morning, she made breakfast and set a plate in front of me like it was the most normal thing in the world, and every time I picked up my fork, I felt a strange mix of gratitude and anger because something so basic had felt impossible just days earlier. Mr. Reynolds, the school counselor, came by again with folders and calm words, explaining processes and next steps in a way that didn't talk down to me, and that alone made me feel older than any label my mother had ever used. He asked me to keep documenting everything I remembered, even small details that seemed unimportant, because those details showed patterns, and patterns told the truth when people tried to minimize what they'd done. So I wrote about the nights I slept with all the lights on because the house felt too empty, about how I drank water to trick my stomach into feeling full, about the way I checked my phone over and over even when I knew no new messages were coming. Writing didn't hurt the way I thought it would. Instead, it felt like pulling splinters out one by one, painful but relieving. A few days later, the caseworker returned with updates, her tone careful but firm, explaining that my mother had been contacted and that her reaction had been shock first, then anger, then denial, as if those stages were as predictable as weather. I imagined her packing some hotel room overseas, phone pressed to her ear, insisting there had been food, insisting I was exaggerating, insisting she'd only been gone a week as if weeks and months blurred when you weren't the one counting hours alone. The caseworker told me I didn't need to worry about managing her feelings, that adults were responsible for the consequences of their choices, and hearing that felt like permission I didn't know I needed. At school, teachers suddenly looked at me differently, not with pity but with awareness, like they were seeing layers they'd missed before, and when someone asked where I'd been staying, I simply said, "With a neighbor," without explaining further, because my story was no longer something I had to defend. One afternoon, Mr. Reynolds sat across from me and asked if I was scared about what would happen when my mother came back, and I surprised both of us by saying I was more scared of what would happen if nothing changed. The truth was, once the silence had been broken, I couldn't imagine going back to pretending it was normal. Weeks passed, and the house next door stayed dark at night, a physical reminder of absence, while inside Mrs. Carter's home there were routines, dinner times, questions about homework, small arguments about vegetables, all the ordinary things that suddenly felt extraordinary. When my mother finally returned, I didn't see her right away. Meetings happened first, conversations behind closed doors, voices kept low but serious, and I was told I didn't have to be present unless I wanted to be. That choice mattered more than anyone realized. Eventually, I did see her, sitting stiffly across a table, eyes red, mouth tight, and for a moment I saw not just my mother but a person facing consequences she hadn't planned for. She tried to explain, to justify, to say she thought I'd be fine, that she needed time for herself, that she never meant for things to get so bad, but the words felt thin against the weight of the notebook sitting in front of me. When she reached for it, her hands shook, and as she flipped through the pages her face changed, realization replacing defensiveness line by line. She watched the videos too, silently, seeing the empty fridge, hearing my small voice nomming days and meals, and when it ended she covered her mouth like she was trying to hold something back. I didn't feel victorious the way I'd imagined during those lonely nights. Instead, I felt steady, grounded in the fact that the truth was finally out in the open where it couldn't be ignored. The adults talked about supervision, about plans, about making sure I was never left like that again, and while I didn't understand every term they used, I understood the most important one. It wouldn't be swept away. Later, alone, my mother asked me why I hadn't called for help sooner, and for the first time I didn't soften the answer. I told her I thought asking meant failing, because that's what happens when independence is used as an excuse instead of a skill taught with care. She cried then, not dramatically, just quietly, and while part of me felt something close to forgiveness beginning to form, another part knew forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. As weeks turned into months, my life settled into a new normal that included check-ins, support, and people who noticed when something was wrong, and my notebook stayed with me, no longer just evidence but a reminder of what happens when silence is allowed to grow unchecked. I learned that being strong didn't mean enduring anything adults decided to put on your shoulders. It meant knowing when to speak, when to document, and when to let the truth do the work you were never meant to do alone. And if there's one thing that summer taught me, it's this. The moment I stopped protecting the story that hurt me was the moment it lost its power over me and gained the power to change everything. Years passed after that summer, but the echo of it never fully left me. It just changed shape, turning from something sharp and immediate into a quiet pressure that reminded me to pay attention when things didn't feel right. Life settled into routines again, but they were different now, built with rules, check-ins, and adults who wrote things down instead of brushing them aside. I moved back home eventually, but the house was no longer allowed to be a place where silence hid problems, and that alone altered everything. My mother tried harder than she ever had before, asking questions she used to avoid, checking the fridge, texting when she was late, explaining plans instead of assuming I would simply adapt. Sometimes the effort felt awkward and forced, like learning a new language badly, but it was still effort, and I learned that accountability doesn't always arrive with anger. Sometimes it arrives with uncomfortable change. At school, I found myself noticing other kids who stayed quiet when teachers asked how things were going at home. Kids who laughed things off too quickly or bragged about how independent they were, and I understood them in a way I hadn't before. Independence, I learned, is supposed to be taught with safety nets, not used as a reason to remove them. I kept writing, even after the case was closed and the reports were filed away, because putting words on paper had become a way to keep myself grounded, a way to make sure my reality stayed real even when other people tried to minimize it. Sometimes I reread the old pages, the ones with shaking handwriting and simple lists of facts, and I was struck by how small and steady that voice was, how determined it sounded despite everything. It reminded me that survival doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a kid quietly deciding that the truth matters enough to protect. As I grew older, my relationship with my mother remained complicated, layered with apologies, boundaries, and conversations that didn't magically fix the past, but acknowledged it honestly. She never again used the word independent the way she had that day in the hallway, and I think that was its own kind of admission. I don't tell this story because I want sympathy or because I enjoy reliving it. I tell it because there are still kids standing in quiet houses right now, holding problems too big for their hands, wondering if they're supposed to be able to handle it alone. What I want them to know, what I wish someone had told me sooner, is that speaking up isn't betrayal, documenting the truth isn't revenge, and asking for help doesn't make you weak. Sometimes the bravest thing an 11-year-old can do is open the door when someone finally knocks, and sometimes that single choice is enough to change the ending of a story that was never supposed to be carried by a child in the first place. As I moved into my teenage years, that summer quietly shaped the way I saw the world, like a scar you don't notice every day but feel when the weather changes. I became observant in ways other kids weren't, noticing who showed up consistently and who only appeared when it was convenient, learning to trust patterns more than promises. Adults often praised me for being mature, and every time I heard that word, it echoed differently now, stripped of its shine, reminding me how easily it can be used to justify absence instead of responsibility. I learned to ask questions without apologizing, to request clarity instead of guessing, and to say, I need help without feeling like I was confessing a failure. My notebook eventually filled up, not just with memories of hunger and fear, but with ordinary things too, school projects, thoughts about friendships, moments of happiness, because I refused to let that summer be the only story it held. Still, I kept the early pages untouched, a quiet reminder that my voice had once protected me when nothing else did. My mother and I talked more openly over time, conversations that were sometimes painful and sometimes healing, but always honest in a way they hadn't been before. She admitted she hadn't understood the weight of what she'd done until she saw it through other adults' eyes, until my words existed on paper where they couldn't be brushed aside. And while that didn't erase the past, it anchored our future in reality instead of denial. I learned that regret doesn't come from being caught. It comes from being confronted with undeniable truth. As I grew older, I volunteered at school programs and community events, drawn to spaces where kids were encouraged to speak and be heard. And more than once I noticed a child lingering after everyone else had left, unsure how to say what they needed. I didn't force conversations or play hero. I simply stayed present, knowing how much that alone could matter. Sometimes all it takes is one person not walking away. When people asked me where my strength came from, I never gave them a neat answer, because strength didn't arrive all at once in some dramatic moment. It was built slowly, out of fear survived, truth spoken, and help accepted. I stopped seeing that summer as something that broke me and started seeing it as something that taught me the cost of silence and the power of documentation. Even now, years later, I still write things down, not because I expect everything to go wrong, but because I know my experiences deserve to be recorded in my own words. I've learned that stories told clearly and honestly have a way of protecting you, of creating boundaries where none existed before. And when I think back to that 11-year-old standing alone in a quiet house with $20 and a shaking voice, I don't feel pity anymore. I feel respect. She opened a door when it mattered. She chose truth over comfort. And in doing so, she turned abandonment into accountability. That decision didn't just change one summer. It changed the trajectory of my life, proving that even when adults fail, a child's truth can still be powerful enough to rewrite the ending. As adulthood slowly came into view, I understood that what happened to me wasn't rare, it was just rarely named, and that realization gave my story a purpose beyond memory. I began to speak when it mattered, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, because clarity is what adults fear most when they've done something wrong. I learned that truth doesn't need anger to be sharp, it only needs consistency. When people tried to dismiss my experience with phrases like, "Your parent didn't mean it," or "they did their best," I learned to respond calmly that impact matters more than intention, especially when a child is involved. That lesson stayed with me in friendships, in school, in every space where power and responsibility intersected. I no longer shrank myself to make others comfortable, and I no longer confused endurance with strength. The notebook eventually stayed closed more often than open, not because its purpose was gone, but because its job was done. It had taught me how to protect myself with truth. And if that summer gave me anything lasting, it was this certainty. Silence protects harm, but speaking, even with a shaking voice, creates witnesses, And once there are witnesses, the story can never be buried again.